Psychoanalysis started here, in Vienna, among a society most of whose names have by now been added to this or some other registry of deaths. Hidden away in this archive, like an unconscious trauma, is the name of a patient whose case history Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, wished to be forgotten. Her name was Emma Eckstein. Hers is a strange story of noses, blood, dreams, and the beginnings of psychoanalysis. Eckstein, it seems, was important to Freud because she reminded him of someone else, a hidden instigator in his early childhood whose memory had been locked away in his unconscious ever since.
I'm actually not at all a man of science, not an observer, not an experimenter, not a thinker. I'm by temperament nothing but a conquistador, an adventurer, with all the curiosity, daring and tenacity characteristic of a man of that sort.
When Freud began treating Eckstein, he was a married man with children, a medical outsider, an obscure Viennese doctor entering middle age. The year was 1895, and Freud was 38 years old. He was experimenting with new sorts of treatments for neurotic illness, treatments involving nothing more than a couch.
There was something that we would today call psychiatry then, but it was very different than what we know as psychiatry today. Not that I have all that much respect for either what is today or what was then, but at the time they were simply putting people in baths, doing various things of that kind. Freud had the notion quite early on, and this is what's so astonishing about him, of listening to people.
He was a man of great ambition. He'd ended up in a strange place in terms of those ambitions, because instead of being a research anatomist or something like that, he was a fooler around with the nervous diseases and the severe chronic neurotics of the end of the century.
Freud himself suffered from mild hysteria, medical symptoms with purely psychological causes, like many of his patients, in fact. They were nonetheless troubling: a bad heart, a pain in his left shoulder, and migraines.
Freud was certainly a neurotic as a young man. He had a kind of railroad phobia, and he had all kind of illnesses which are reported as illnesses which we would now rather consider as psychosomatic.
He himself was always seeing the irony of not knowing whether his heart symptoms, for instance, were psychosomatic or organic. Was he going to die the next day of heart disease, or was he just like one of his patients with an anxiety neurosis?
The medical establishment in Vienna was not receptive to Freud or to his ideas. His closest medical friend in the world was an ear, nose and throat specialist in Berlin, 3 years younger than him, by the name of Wilhelm Fliess. Freud wrote nearly 300 letters to Fliess. Of the correspondence, only Freud's letters have survived.
It's clear from reading these letters that, at least at the beginning, and up until practically the end, in fact, Fliess had the upper hand. Fliess was the person calling the shots.
We now think that Wilhelm Fliess was really Freud's analyst. It was a kind of an analysis through letters. Freud had a tremendous positive transference towards Fliess, whom he considered as a great man.
What does that mean, a positive transference?
Well, his feelings were there. He loved him. He loved him.
Dearest Wilhelm, I must hurriedly write to you about something that greatly astonishes me. In the last few days I have been feeling quite unbelievably well.
Fliess would come to Vienna and he would fiddle with Freud's nose. He would do various things to it, including cauterize it. Well, because he was an ear, nose, and throat specialist, so he said, all your problems are in your nose, Freud, Sigmund, let me help you. And he burned parts of the inside of the nose, and then Freud would say, oh yes, I feel much better. And they would describe to one another, Freud primarily would describe to Fliess exactly what kind of mucus was coming out of his nose, as if Fliess would be interested, and presumably Fliess was interested. So it was this sort of thing, you know, that have led people to say they were interested in one another's bodily fluids. Usually men don't discuss their bodily fluids in that way. So when thought of it as something of a, that's why I say unconscious, unknown homosexual relationship.
I show you an instrument for cauterization, which Fliess made an operation with Freud. And there you see the way to the battery, and there you have the button for heating, and you can bring it in the nose to the position where you like, and then you put the bottom, and on this position you can burn away parts of the tissue.
Dearest Wilhelm, light but regular symptoms. In the morning a stuffed nose and a vile head. I did not get better until large amounts had been discharged, and meanwhile I had several migraines.
Fliess had what he called the periodicity theory. He thought everything in life for a woman was connected with the number 28. And everything for a man was connected with the number 23. So because Freud was half man, half woman, according to Fliess, 28 and 23 were his critical numbers. If you add them up, it gives 51. So Freud believed for a long time, I'm going to die at 51. Fliess had certain odd beliefs about what he called reflex neurosis. That is the way things reflect one another. The way, and especially, he's famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, for holding that the nose reflected what happened in a woman's genitals. Freud had a very interesting patient, one of the first people that he subjected to psychoanalysis. Her name, in fact, probably the first person to be in analysis. Her name was Emma Eckstein.
Emma is subject at the present time to a compulsion of not being able to go into shops alone. As a reason for this, she produced a memory from when she was 12 years old. She remembered that the two of them were laughing at her clothes, and that one of them had pleased her sexually.
She was a very hysterical woman.
In what way was she hysterical?
No, she was very hysterical. For instance, she didn't get up from her sofa. She said she couldn't walk. She was lying on the bed and as being sick.
He had absolutely no reason to believe that what she was saying was not anything except the truth. And at the same time, he was telling Fliess about this. Now, Fliess was listening to these stories, and excuse me for using the word stories, I don't mean that they were invented, I mean her Geschichte, as we say in German, the story of her life, from a totally different perspective than Freud. He was thinking the nose, the nose, the nose. And he said to Freud, I'd like to visit. I'd like to see Emma Eckstein. So when he went to Vienna, he was in Berlin. And when he went to Vienna, he asked Freud to meet with Emma Eckstein, and he did. And the first thing he told Freud is, she has a suspicious nose, eine suspekte Nase. In other words, he suspected, by looking at her nose, that something was going on in her genitals. And he turned to Freud and he said, the woman masturbates.
She came from a very, very good intellectual family. Her sister was the first woman MP in the Austrian Parliament. Her brother was a leading social democrat and so on. And she was the one in the family who, if you like, contained the family neuroses.
Freud was just starting to develop his principles of psychoanalytic technique, and one of these was the so-called transference. And that means that in an actual relationship with the psychoanalyst, the patient, in that case Emma Eckstein, is repeating an important relationship of her early childhood. Probably he did not, as he later did, realize in depth that Emma Eckstein fell in love with him.
She went to Freud as a patient who'd always suffered from nosebleeds and who had mutilated herself and had had very severe period problems as well. And at this point, Freud, because of his friendship with Fliess, knowing of Fliess's interest that problems to do with nosebleeds could have some kind of organic basis or link with a genital problem, actually decided to refer her to Fliess.
We don't have an account of how he did it, but we know that he opened up her nose and took out the middle bone, the turbinate bone.
The turbinate bones are the most important parts from functional point of view. You see here an X-ray of a patient's face with his both eyes, the nose and the maxillary sinus. And here the pathological situation with a very much enlarged turbinate on the right side and a small turbinate on the left side nose, and we have 3 turbinates on each side.
This is the thought to the operation of Emma Eckstein, and first I show you the nose speculum and to put in the scissors. And then I can show you the pliers to go in the nose and to put out the bone. And then we have the pincers to take pieces out of the nose, like this one. And then the last instrument I show you is the pincers to put in something. And there you see the tamponada.
And that this was a major operation, a delicate operation, a difficult operation, and one that Fliess had never performed before. So he did his first piece of surgery on Emma Eckstein. Well, guess what happened? He opened the nose and he forgot, in quotation marks, to take out the packing. In other words, there was terrible bleeding. He packed it with 1/2 meter of surgical gauze, and he left it in the wound. He forgot to take it out. So this stuff began to fester, you can imagine. And Emma Eckstein, meanwhile, is coming every day into analysis with Freud, lying on the couch and saying, "I'm in terrible pain." Freud is trying to figure out what's the psychology behind the pain, but he begins to notice over the first week, there's a terrible smell in his room. He can actually smell this rotting gauze in her nose. Finally, he's terrified and he calls in a surgeon. Remember, Fliess is in Berlin now. He's writing to Fliess and saying, "Gee, I don't understand. The woman's not doing well. She complains of terrible pain. She's bleeding all the time." Fliess says, "Don't pay any attention to it. It's fine. Nothing wrong." Freud finally calls in a proper surgeon in Vienna. Surgeon comes in and notices a little piece of string hanging from her nose, in other words, a piece of the gauze, and pulls it. And out comes this gauze, and she starts to hemorrhage, nearly bleeding to death. So they perform an emergency operation, and they're able to stop the bleeding, and she slowly starts to get better.
After she had been packed, I fled to the next room, drank a bottle of water and felt miserable. She, though, in spite of the danger during the succeeding hours, felt happy as never before.
And he had a new neurotic symptom to analyze, which was her happiness. Now, why should someone be so happy when their life had almost been cut short by a terrible accident by the surgeon? So Freud was then led to investigate what bleeding meant for Emma.